going to begin by being very clear that physical relations between men and women as God established it is not evil. The reason the death penalty was prescribed in the law of Moses, as we hear in the gospel of the woman caught in adultery, is because these relations are holy. To break the sixth commandment is not to do something dirty, it is to perform a sacrilege. And the sin that's behind all of these sins is the sin of lust. So we'll be talking about that today. But before I speak about the sin of lust, I want to again introduce the concept here with wounds. So from Dr. Bob Schutt's book on the subject, he says, if lust is the issue you struggle with most, I imagine that you use impurity or impure imagery to soothe the pain of rejection or feelings of not being desirable. To soothe the pain of rejection or feelings of not being desirable. And my experience is for those who really are fighting against sins of impurity, if they are not succeeding, it is because of that reason. They are not addressing the wounds themselves. So what is this sin? Lust is the vice of indulging in unlawful sexual pleasures. Like with all the other sins, the unlawful is the important part here, whether it's in our minds or in our bodies. Our Lady of Fatima told Lucia that more souls go to hell for this sin than for any other. That doesn't mean that it's the worst sin, it just happens to be the most popular. The most popular. But before we talk about what it is, again, we want to have the caveats here. First, lust is not the same thing as merely appreciating the beauty of another human being. There's a lot of good-looking people in the world, and it is not a sin to appreciate that. The sin comes when you're doing more than just the initial appreciation. And similarly, lust is not all sexual pleasure. Note what we said above. It's not merely pleasure, but the unlawful pleasure. There are certainly lawful pleasures. Now, let's be very clear here. There's a very common error which I need to address. There's this notion that some people have, mainly men, that as long as you're doing it with your spouse, then it's legitimate. As long as you're not committing adultery, doing this. No, that's not the case. There are only certain ways this is supposed to work, and I'm keeping this as G-rated as possible. You get the idea. There are only certain ways this is supposed to work. If you are doing other things other than that, it doesn't matter whether it's with your spouse or not. You are using your spouse thereby for the sake of pleasure instead of the way God intended this. You should be grateful that He has added that pleasurable part to it, but that is not the primary purpose of these relationships. And again, I'm going to stop there. If you have any questions about what I'm talking about, I'll be glad to explain, but I'm not going to go into more detail publicly. Why is this sin so evil? Well, there's a number of reasons. In addition to being the reason why most souls go to hell, in my experience, it is one of the two reasons why most people quit the practice of the Christian religion. The other one is simply because they don't understand it and don't believe in the actual tenets. But this is one of them. It's a capital sin because there are also many consequences to this sin. All the capital sins have many consequences to them. And in this case, lust blinds the mind, perverts the will, and hardens the heart. It causes inconstancy and repentance, brings about aversion to God because His law forbids the desired pleasure, and fosters an excessive love of the things of this world. Impurity wraps itself around all our senses and through them enters into our soul. It blinds us to spiritual values, darkens our minds, weakens our wills, and leads us to place a created good before God, which is, of course, idolatry. When one seeks and directly wills this pleasure, it's also always a mortal sin, hence why so many souls go to hell. Lust causes us to be enslaved to sinful habits, making us selfish and throws us off balance interiorly as well. Now, how do we deal with this? Well, there's a two-part plan. And the first part of this is having the right attitude. We have to be convinced of the necessity of fighting against this sin. Oh, it's okay. No, it's not okay. And what that boils down to is that people find it difficult and therefore stop trying. There is a necessity to fight against this sin. But we have to be convinced not only of the necessity, but of the possibility of being pure. Because we're not going to be motivated if we don't actually believe that's possible. This is where a lot of people's frustrations come in, is because they're constantly fighting against the sin, they're constantly failing, and so they feel that it's not actually possible. It is possible. For those who have not tried like they ought to, St. Paul says to the Hebrews, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. But I do want to offer a little bit of hope, especially for those who have been fighting and still find difficulties. Going back to what I said at the very beginning, my experience is that for most people who are going to confession, going to Mass, praying their rosary, and trying to follow Christ, and yet continue to fall regularly into sins of impurity, it is because they are using it as a pacifier. Because it feels better than the bad feelings they've got. Dr. Schutz is talking about feelings of rejection and not being desirable. But whatever it is, most people use impurity as a pacifier so that they don't have to feel their feelings to make themselves feel better. It's a drug. And so therefore, you are not going to find success without addressing what wounds that you are trying to medicate. Now, what form does our resistance to lust take? Well, the first is prevention. You know the saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we need to guard and we need to avoid. We need to guard our senses, because while all our sins are choices we make, the fact is that we feed ourselves impurity through our senses. We must be careful of whatever it is that will incite us to lust. And this does vary a little bit person to person. But everyone has to guard against it. And we also have to avoid what we call the near occasions of sin. We talk about this in our act of contrition. We resolve, in fact, with God's grace in our act of contrition to avoid these near occasions. What are some of these near occasions, especially regarding lust? They include idleness. Don't have time to sin if you're not being idle. Attachment to comfort and excess in food and drink. Again, you cannot say no to yourself in this area, your body in this area. You cannot say no to your body in food and drink, which is why, and comfort, which is why our practices of Lent are so important, and the fact that we should do penance regularly. What we hear and see, as well as spending time with those to whom we are attracted without any safeguards. And of course, for most people, one of the greatest occasions of sin is the internet. Spend less time or get off your damn phones. You do not need to be on the internet most of the time. And you certainly do not need to be on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and all these other places where impurity just flows. You're like, well, it's not outright. No, of course it's not outright. That's because we've gotten so desensitized to people being scantily clad or engaging in lustful behavior that's not outright sexual relations, that we are numb to the fact that billboards and everything else around us has these things constantly. We have to cut them out as much as possible. You do not need to spend the time on the internet that you do in most cases. The other part, of course, of this is the cure. These are very basic things that we know we need to do. We need to pray, especially in temptation. We need the sacraments, especially confession and the Holy Eucharist. And we need to practice these mortifications and fasts as we've spoken about. Again, the law of the church is lame in this. You have to do more than this. It has to be a way of life. Does that mean you can never celebrate? Does it mean you can never have any food you like? Of course not. But most people that I know, and that includes myself, indulge themselves too much and avoid the discomfort whenever possible, which makes us enemies of the cross of Christ. You cannot resist sin and temptation if you constantly give in to the things that you want that are not sinful. Now, I am aware of how insidious this sin is. It affects men and women, young and old, every sexual orientation, all cultures, any demographic you can think of. And because our sexuality is a reflection of the relationships within the Most Holy Trinity, and because marriage is a reflection of the relationship between Christ and his church, we have to be adamant about this. We have to maintain that relations of this kind are holy, and we must therefore be convinced of our obligation to God to keep them that way. We have to have the same attitude expressed by St. Paul to the Philippians. I consider everything as a loss because of the supreme good of knowing Jesus Christ my Lord. For his sake I have accepted the loss of all things, and I consider them so much rubbish that I may gain Christ and be found in him. Our love of God has to come first. My words have been so strict today because I hear confessions, because I know what's going on. I know how insidious this is. I know how dangerous this is. Our souls are in real danger, and I don't want you to lose your souls over this. But that does not mean that I don't understand the struggle, and that's why I am patient, at least for Father Lola. Never yelled at anyone in the confessional. Don't make me be the first. Won't be a problem. In fact, I'm so kind that some people don't even recognize me. All right? Get to confession. I would rather hear your confession every day for sins that you are fighting against than for you to give up and go to hell. Because those are the only two options. You either fight and hope, or you give up and guarantee to lose your soul. Now, I would rather not hear your confessions every day for the same sins, but if I have to, I will. Because that means that you're at least trying, and the effort is worth it. And so please keep fighting. Pray, 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 especially your Holy Rosary, of course, and fight, soldier of Christ. Fight for your salvation